Did you know that if you had been wearing glasses 50 years ago, you could have been executed? Not because of a choice, not because of a crime, but because the government would know that you could read and write, and to them you were too dangerous to be allowed to live.
Look around you today. We live in the era of hyper-information. The modern world idolizes intelligence. Your success is measured by the degrees on your wall, the books you've read, your ability to debate and argue. We were taught that knowledge is the greatest weapon anyone can possess.
But human history today hides a disturbing secret, a dark side that most people prefer to ignore.
Intelligence wasn't always a virtue. There were times when being brilliant was the worst mistake you could possibly make, a giant target painted on your back. If you wanted to keep your head on your shoulders, you had to master the hardest, most painful and humiliating art of all, the art of looking like a complete idiot. But why is power so terrified of those who think? The answer to that is colder and more calculating than you can imagine. To understand how intelligence becomes a death sentence, we need to look into the psychology of tyrants. Dictators, totalitarian regimes, and absolute emperors aren't afraid of rival armies. An army is made of men, weapons, and tanks. You can calculate its size, design defense strategies, and fight it with brute force. But an oppressor's true terror isn't physical, it's invisible. They are terrified of ideas. An idea cannot be shot by a firing squad. It acts like a highly contagious silent virus. It enters an individual's mind through a book, a conversation, or a single question. That individual begins to look at reality and notice the contradictions of the system. They pass the idea to their neighbor, who passes it to a co-worker. And by the time the dictator notices, the very foundation supporting his throne has already begun to rot. An idea cannot be shot by a firing squad. It acts like a highly contagious silent virus. It enters an individual's mind through a book, a conversation, or a single question. That individual begins to look at reality and notice the contradictions of the system. They pass the idea to their neighbor, who passes it to a co-worker. And by the time the dictator notices, the very foundation supporting his throne has already begun to rot.
That's why the first major strategy of any oppressive regime throughout history is what sociologists call cutting down the tallest poppies.
If a field of poppies is growing, those few flowers that grow faster and stand taller than the rest block the view and draw attention. To those in power, these tallest poppies are the intellectuals, the scientists, the philosophers, and the teachers. If you stood out from the homogeneous crowd, if you asked the wrong question at the wrong time, or if you showed a shred of critical thinking that could wake others up, the gears of the state moved against you. You simply vanished in the middle of the night, leaving no trace behind. The blueprint has always been crystal clear: dumb down the population to make them domesticable. But no place in the world took this logic to a more terrifying extreme than Cambodia. In 1975, an extremist organization called the Khmer Rouge, led by a man known as Pol Pot, seized power in Cambodia. Their plan was radical, almost unbelievable by modern standards. They wanted to restart history. They wanted to erase the past and transform the country into a perfect medieval agrarian utopia. They called it Year Zero. For this plan to work, Pol Pot decided that any and all influence from the modern world had to be destroyed. And who represented the modern world? Anyone who possessed technical, scientific, or cultural knowledge. Having an intellect was officially deemed a crime of high treason. The persecution that followed was of a blind, raw brutality. It didn't matter if you were a scientist on the verge of discovering a cure for a disease, or a teacher showing children how to add. If you had a formal education, you were viewed as a parasite that needed to be cleansed from the new society. And how did the soldiers, many of them indoctrinated children, identify intellectuals? By the most trivial details. If you spoke a second language, you were guilty. If your hands were soft and calloused-free, it was a sign that you worked with your mind and not with the earth. Therefore you were guilty. And as we mentioned at the beginning, the ultimate death verdict was wearing glasses. Having astigmatism or nearsightedness became synonymous with reading books, and reading books meant thinking. Imagine the scene. Renowned engineers, lawyers, doctors, and artists found themselves forced to burn their diplomas in hidden bonfires in their backyards. They destroyed their book collections, tore up photographs of their graduations. They had to adopt fake identities, dress in peasant clothes, force calluses onto their hands, and purposefully mispronounce words in front of the guards. They had to pretend to be completely illiterate just to save their own lives and those of their families. Any slip-up, a single word spoken with a more refined vocabulary, and the destination was an execution field. Those who couldn't contain the brilliance of their own minds disappeared into the earth. When we look at this horror, we realize that the need to hide knowledge is not exclusive to 1970s Cambodia. Throughout the centuries, the most brilliant minds on earth realized that other people's ignorance is a dangerous beast and that intelligence causes a devastating side effect: envy and fear. The German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer wrote extensively about this. He claimed that most people can tolerate any kind of inferiority, whether in beauty, wealth, or health. But the only inferiority human beings truly cannot forgive is intellectual inferiority. Seeing someone much smarter nearby triggers a profound discomfort in the ego of the masses. Schopenhauer said that to coexist in harmony and avoid the destructive resentment of others, we should frequently adopt feigned stupidity. In other words, knowing when to keep your best ideas to yourself and blend into the environment. For ancient thinkers like Socrates, who was sentenced to death precisely for making people think, or for medieval scientists who had to hide their discoveries from the Inquisition to avoid being burned alive, Schopenhauer's philosophy wasn't a piece of etiquette advice to get along at work. It was a tactical, psychological guerrilla move, a matter of biological survival. In those moments in history, Darwin's theory of evolution suffered an ironic twist. The fittest to survive was neither the strongest nor the smartest. The fittest was the one who could best camouflage themselves within the generalized mediocrity. This brings us back to the present, to the world you and I live in right now. Today, we don't fear being sent to forced labor camps for wearing glasses or reading a philosophy book. But the essence of human nature hasn't changed. We moved away from an era where we were punished for knowing too much, and entered an era where we are encouraged to expose everything, all the time. Social media demands that you have an opinion on every topic, show your daily routine, and prove your worth and intelligence every single second to gain validation. But stop and think, is total exposure actually safe? Has the advice of the ancient sages lost its validity? The truth is, an excess of light can also blind. When you prove to be too brilliant in an unprepared environment, you become an involuntary target. Whether in the workplace, social circles, or online, the hyperexposure of your capability attracts eyes you do not want to attract. History leaves us an uncomfortable, timeless lesson. Knowledge gives you power and sets you free on the inside, but silence and discretion are the only things that guarantee your protection on the outside. Sometimes true wisdom does not lie in winning every debate or showing off how much you know. True wisdom lies in understanding the strategic value of knowing exactly when to